Hi, it's Chris with Implied Music. Tricks with tritones. It sounds a little clickbaity, but the tritone is probably the single most important interval in Western music theory. A tritone, augmented fourth, three whole steps. The sound of the tritone is baked in to tonic dominant relationships and into so many interesting chords and chord progressions. Let's see what it can do for us. Well, real quickly, if this is the second or third video of mine you've seen and you're getting something out of this channel, you're not subscribed, now's the time to subscribe. Trying to build a community of musicians, artists, composers, producers who are trying to grow their own individual musical lives, their understanding of what's true for them about their music. I hope this is music theory for everyone. So 1979, I started studying with Dr. Roland Wiggins, and his musical vocabulary, the depth of his understanding was such that after about 20 minutes of a lecture from him, my eyes would roll up in my head and I would basically pass out in the back of the classroom. Of course, it didn't help that his seminar was after dinner, so I was kind of tired at that point. But eventually I persevered. And what Roland used to say to me, and he was an amazing pianist, is the tritone is the center of everything. Let's do a little review, just talk about what we're trying to get at here. So you recall that in the major scale, there's a bunch of intervals that you can build. A perfect fifth here and here and here and here and here and here until we get here. That interval between B and F is called a tritone. And it's called a tritone because it's two notes, three whole steps apart. That tritone is a fascinating and powerful sound. It is to our ears dissonant, and it really would like to resolve. The top note came down a half step, the bottom note went up a half step. The B is called the leading tone in the C scale, and it does push us to C. And the F, by its own kind of like tendencies, would very much like to go down to E in melodies. And when you put those two things together, you get a very powerful sound. In fact, a sound that's so powerful that music theorists, beginning with the sort of earliest music theorists, called the seventh chord that lives on the fifth step of the scale the dominant chord. This seventh chord contains the tritone, and that tritone really wants to resolve. As it happens, the seventh chord on the seventh step of the scale also contains that tritone. We're going to get back to that in a moment. Well, for the longest time in music theory, that tritone was kind of like a big pivot concept. And you wind up with music that uses the tritone to push you into a new place. For instance, this C chord could be followed by an E7 chord, and that tritone on top so much wants to resolve that I wind up on A minor, and I've got a sense that I've actually transcended my original position and moved to a new position. This thing that we do is called a secondary dominant. I've taken a new tritone, in this case the E7, and I've used it as a pivot to go to A minor. Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms. For the longest time, that's kind of how we use tritones. It was about the only kind of like use for them. In fact, in a sense, the tritone and the dominant chord is the engine for conventional Western music theory. And if you start listening for it, you'll hear it everywhere. But listen, we're modern composers and we want to push things forward. And to that end, I want you to look at this chord. This is a complicated chord. So this chord itself, sometimes called the Prometheus or mystical chord, is obviously a C dominant chord, according to my little analysis here, but it has kind of like another couple of qualities, and probably the single most important quality is the ambiguity of the two tritones that live within the chord. Scriabin and 20th century composers started to float dominant chords freely all over the place, and this chord is actually sort of a collection of notes that live within the harmonic series. We've got two tritones. That in itself, very jazz sound. And jazz and blues and classical music beginning in the early part of the 20th century, you know, sort of the pre-serial music, said, I can float dominant chords anywhere I'd like. It's a very specific sound, but it's really powerful. C7. So beautiful, right? Let's float to a new chord, just another dominant chord. We don't care almost where we go. E flat 7, right? Why not? A7. Where should we go? How about F7? Now, it's sort of like defies analysis, right? And yet, if you look at what I just did, you'll see that in each of them, this interval at the bottom was my tritone. And as I rethought what I did, that tritone propelled me forward. Dominant chords are so powerful that way. Listen, if you're playing a blues, every chord can be a dominant chord. And I tell you what, it sounds awesome, right? I'll take a C blues. F7. Back to C7. And there's just something about it. That dominant sound. A7, D7, G7 flat 9, C, A7, D7, G7, and I'm going to resolve it. I'm going to resolve to C7. All those dominant chords. Well, here's the last sort of like gimme on this, because dominant chords don't have exclusive rights to our tritone. There are two other chords that I want to look at that have tritones baked in, and we're going to put aside the symmetrical chords for a moment and just kind of talk about how they get used in modern music. And the first one is, I promised you this, the chord that's built on the seventh step of the major scale. This is called a half-diminished seventh chord. We've got a root, a minor third, a flat 5, and a minor 7th. And between the root and the flat 5, there's our tritone. Now, it's hardly ever used as a dominant chord per se. Like, I probably wouldn't play, it has a tritone in it, but it's not a 5 of E, is it? I'll tell you what it is. It's a 2, B half diminished. E7 flat 9 resolves to A minor major 7. I'm going to play it on the screen so you can follow along. It's the 2 of A minor when A minor is my home chord. Very dark and beautiful sound. Let's scroll up so we can see everything there. Gorgeous, right? This chord here, its tritone just hangs out as I move to the tritone inflected E7 chord, and then that hangs out the note on the top as I move to A minor major 7. This note on top, which it's spelling there, is A flat horribly. It should be G sharp. That's the major 7. I love that tritone. Okay, one more trick with tritones, and this is an interesting one because I'll tell you what, this tritone sits in the chord but doesn't push us. All right. We've all heard this chord. It's funny. So some people call it the Christmas chord, the minor 4 chord with a 6th attached. And I'm just going to play it in root position so it's easy to see. So that's F minor 6. And baked into that chord is this tritone. But there's just something kind of beautiful and elegant, somewhat propulsive, somewhat sad. And you've probably, I don't know, you're probably thinking to yourself, Chris, that chord looks familiar. The notes, are those notes there? Which are the notes from the half-diminished chord on D? Yeah, that's exactly right. So here's a Christmassy chord progression. C, E minor, F, F minor 6. It's yearning, isn't it? C, E minor, F, F minor 6. That tritone sits in there, and I'll tell you, it's not a spicy sounding I must resolve tritone. The tritone here, where would it resolve? I guess it would either come in to those 2 notes or go out to those 2 notes. And it doesn't do either. It goes back to its starting chord, C. The 4 minor 6 chord has its own integrity and identity. It's a trick with tritones. There are some other fun things that you can do with tritones around the circle of fifths, but I think this is kind of enough for today. Think about it. The first thing Roland said to me, and I started off saying this, he said that tritones are kind of the most important thing. The first thing that Roland said to me as we were analyzing piano music was, you get your score and you take a look at it and notice the accidentals in the score. Notice what's happening with the dominant chords. Pick out the tritones. Tritones in common practice Western music, in jazz and blues, and in even a lot of contemporary classical writing are little signposts, corners that the harmony is turning in order to push the listener's ear into new places, to create moments of tension that can propel our story forward. Well, I hope this has been useful. Like and subscribe and ding the bell. You'll be notified when I do my videos. I'll see you next time.